You're back with The Good Word, and it's time for Under the Covers, in which Finlay MacDonald goes in search of the story behind a famous New Zealand book. This time, Jane Mander's Story of a New Zealand River.
For every tale printed on pages and bound inside an alluring cover, there's another story. The story behind the book, how it started, struggled, what inspired it, who wrote it and why. To find out, we go under the covers. The official history of New Zealand literature involves the long struggle for a local voice to emerge and then to be appreciated. The trouble is, when just such a voice emerged in the form of Jane Mander at the dawn of the 20th century, it was largely dismissed as insufficiently British or Victorian. That the story of a New Zealand river was published in the United States in 1920, nearly 2 decades before it appeared in New Zealand, says as much about its author as it does the peculiarities of our early 20th century literary tastes. Jane Mander was not just a pioneering novelist, she was a pioneering woman, full stop.
Jane Mander wanted to write, and of course in the time that she was writing, the only way you could be published was to be published in England. And so she wanted to be where the publishing houses were. She also wanted to have more experiences. She felt very stultified in New Zealand.
An adventurous sort, Mander escaped the Kiwi backblocks, first to Sydney, then London, and eventually New York. Taking to life in Manhattan, she set her sights on the prestigious Columbia School of Journalism, having already broken into the then male-dominated newspaper world back in New Zealand.
She found herself meeting other writers, meeting other artists, meeting sort of bohemian-style people, really, which suited her perfectly. And, you know, she could smoke a cigarette and nobody was going to frown at her, and she could have a drink and nobody was going to frown at her. And so she could live this life that she had dreamed that she would live.
In 1917 in New York, she turned 40. Never in the best of health, with constant money worries and a rigorous study schedule, the ever-determined Mander nevertheless managed to complete her debut novel. The story of a New Zealand river is about an English woman named Alice, cast out of her family for having a baby out of wedlock and forced to flee to the colonies where she might pose as a widow and teach piano. She eventually marries a New Zealander and goes to live in an isolated Kauri logging settlement on the banks of the Kaipara River with her daughter Asia. The man who takes her up the river, however, becomes besotted with her, and she with him, though she can never express such feelings. Will true love prevail? Can Alice overcome the strictures of Victorian morality to be with the man she really wants? Can playing the piano be any substitute for lovemaking? These are the elements that made the story of a New Zealand river relatively racy for its time, and an early milestone in local literature.
I think really before The Story of a New Zealand River, we had a lot of books that had scenery and the characters sort of placed in front of the scenery. But I think what happened with Story of a New Zealand River was Jane Mander created some psychology for her characters. So the characters are real, in particular the daughter Asia, are very, very real and strong. And I also think she evoked the beauty of the Kauri forest and then the horror of the milling.
I don't want to sound like some expert here, because I'm not an expert, I'm just a fan. In her work, she captures the loneliness and the melancholy and the minor key of the Kaipara. And this is true of a lot of the other West Coast harbours of New Zealand, but the Kaipara being a big one, there were a lot of lonely places on it. And she has that feeling right through her writing, even when she's talking about something quite different.
The book is at least partly autobiographical, in the sense that Mander herself was the daughter of a colonial timber miller, and her childhood involved many relocations as the family followed their father's fortunes around the North Island. And by the 1880s, the Manders were living and working around the Kaipara harbour, to become the setting of Jane's yet-to-be-written novel.
In the story of a New Zealand river, she describes the house that Alice comes to with great detail, and it would have been just the sort of house that she would have lived in Port Albert or in that area where they lived. And so she carried through all those memories from her childhood and used them to great effect in the book.
Delayed by the war, the book eventually landed with an anticlimactic thud. As Manda later said, "From my childhood days I had dreamed of the day when my first book would be published, but when it came to my flat in New York, I was too tired even to open the parcel." It would be another 7 decades before the story of a New Zealand river really made headlines.
Jane Campion has always claimed the Oscar-winning screenplay for the piano was an original. But a film guide published in Australia claims the movie is based on the novel, The Story of a New Zealand River.
I can remember sitting in the theatre at the end of the film and thinking, as the credits are rolling, and thinking there should be a credit there for Jane, and there's not. And I thought that was wrong.
If she hasn't been well treated by history or the literary establishment, Jane Manda still deserves credit for what she achieved, and her most famous book deserves to be read by more New Zealanders.
I know it's said that she's not regarded as one of the great New Zealand writers, and I don't really go with all that. I love her prose, it works for me. If I was in the company of people who are the experts in New Zealand lit, who would tell me that Jane Manda shouldn't be up there, I would take them on, yeah. I'd take them on, I'd defend her to the last. I'd fight on the banks of the Kaiwaka River for her, all the way down to Point Curtis. I met Jane Manda this morning on the track to Point Curtis. She was looking her prettiest. I told her so. She thanked me. I met Jane Manda this morning. Her cross-eyed servant boy kept a blank eye on us. It shouldn't be allowed, I told her. Such prettiness makes me giddy. She put it down to the heat, suggested we sit by the river and watch the tide come in. The moon was full, she told me. That's why the tide's a big one. We laughed. She always made me laugh, often enough cry. We made love by the Kaiwaka on a big tide, Jane Manda and I.
And that's the good word for this time. Thanks to our panel and our special guest, Lisa Tamati. If you'd like to know more about the people and books featured on the show, go to our website at tvnz.co.nz and use the keywords good word. See you back here next time.